Okay, so yesterday we talked about multiculturalism. So I want to review what we said yesterday and then add some more ideas to the idea. And then, from my point of view, we finish with it. The first thought was, sometimes multiculturalism is expressed as a direction, a rule to treat different cultures equally. And the reason for doing so that's given is, it's impossible to show that one culture is better than another culture because what standards would you use for evaluating the cultures? If you're going to make that evaluation, then you're going to use standards of your culture. And it's illogical to take the standards from culture A and use them to evaluate culture B. And since you can't evaluate cultures, certainly not comparatively, therefore you should treat them all equally. I pointed out that really, instead of supporting the conclusion, the reason contradicts the conclusion. Because if there are no objective, neutral standards with which to evaluate cultures, not only can't you come to the conclusion that culture A is superior to culture B, but you can't come to the conclusion that culture A is equal to culture B, because that's also an evaluation. So what you have to say is, I can't say anything about the values of cultures. Well, if you can't say anything about the values of culture, why then are you given a directive? This is how you have to treat them. Where is that coming from? So you could even just do as you feel. If you like one, support it. If you don't like the other, don't support it. That's one problem. Then there's another way of putting the reason for multiculturalism, and that is that people in different cultures can't understand one another. They can't understand each other's culture. Since they can't understand it, there can't be any competent evaluation. And to this we pointed out that it seems that people certainly can understand pieces of other cultures, otherwise emigration would be impossible. Otherwise, joint cooperation between cultures would be impossible, and neither of those is true. Even to the extent of making the judgment that by my own values, your culture has something that's better for me than what I have. Which means that the implied prejudice, well, if you're going to use your standards to judge another culture, of course it's going to come out inferior, isn't correct. I could use my standards and judge that the other culture is superior to mine. And that's why cultures learn from one another. That's why cultures change their forms through contact with one another. So there's no reason to think that it's impossible to deal with the idea of evaluating a culture. And then we pointed out that the cultural products of one culture are going to be applicable to other cultures, so that there's no barrier between overlapping, so that a tool or a strategy or a calculation that's done in one culture can be borrowed by another culture or applied by the one culture to the other culture without any loss of relevance. Then we said the place where people want to push the difference between cultures and hands off is values. At that point, they'll say, well, if you think that something is right or wrong, good or bad, just or unjust, obligatory or forbidden, when you say those words, you're using them the way your culture uses them. But in another culture, other things might be right or wrong. Different things from the ones that you classify as right or wrong. or good or bad, etc., etc. So the idea of evaluating another culture on the basis of your values, when they may have alternative values to yours, is just prejudiced. How would you be able to say that culture, or what that culture does, is bad, if when you say bad, you mean bad as you understand it and as you have... Okay, so let's try to get back on track. We're talking about values, and the question will be, you're talking about what's right and what's wrong and what's good and what's evil and so forth and so on your own values, but they have different right and different wrong and different good and good, different evil. So we said two things about that. First of all, not anything counts as an acceptable disagreement. When someone says something to you which, by your lights, the way you use your words is crazy, then you have to decide, how shall I respond? If you think the person's intelligent, if you think the person is serious, then the way you respond is by saying, I don't know what you mean. You couldn't mean what I mean, because if you meant what I meant, you know very obviously that it's wrong. So what do you mean? That means there's been a breakdown in communication. So somebody tells you there's a culture in which they believe that torturing small children for fun is morally okay. The right response is, I don't think so, because that's an obvious mistake in morality. And if they're intelligent people, they couldn't make that mistake, so you must not understand what they mean. So we're not going to tolerate the idea that there are cultures that have widely differing values from ours. And to make the same point again, but in a deeper fashion, we are discussing in English what to say in English about a foreign culture. We are using English words with English concepts behind them. So if someone says to me, you should say their values are that torturing small children for fun is permissible, he's telling me to say, in my language, something that's absurd. Well, it's not an acceptable description in English, because that's not what values are. So that being the case, I have every right and every responsibility to use my words with my concepts to describe the world that I see.
But if you were to use their language to describe what they're doing as correct, would that be wrong?
Okay, this is a very important point. We didn't speak about this yesterday. So I have every right to describe the world in my language, in my way. Let me start with a more sort of primitive question. Should they care about how I describe it?
No.
One second. Let's go step by step. Should they care about how I describe it? Not necessarily. They have their culture, and they have their priorities, and they have the things that they're committed to. And they may say, you can describe it as you like, but we do other things. And what should I do about that? Well, let's say, according to my description, one of their people is victimizing another of their people. Right? They don't recognize that. Let's say they don't have any values at all. They just don't do morality. They do other things. Right? He's still being victimized. It's still a crime, a moral crime. So that being the case, by my lights, the world will be a better place if I stop him. And the fact that he doesn't know that or doesn't appreciate that, that doesn't mean that what I believe is any less true. So the fact that I can't convince him doesn't mean that I should be any less positive about what I believe. Kids say this sort of thing all the time, and now it's become so sophisticated that 22-year-old college students think it's very clever. You know, I say that what they're doing is evil, but they would say it too. They'd say what you're doing is evil. Yeah, parrots will also say with things like that, right? But the fact that they'll say it doesn't mean that it has any purchase. Why do I have to listen to what they have to say? They'll say, they don't have to listen to you either. That's right. They don't have to listen, but I don't have to leave them alone because they won't listen. Why should I do that? Because according to my rights. So I told you the story about the co-ed at Stanford, when she found out about clitorectomy, and she struggled with that because it was in a foreign culture, and she finally came to the conclusion that, although by my lights the girls are being victimized, it's their culture, I can't say anything about it. And that's a mistake. What difference does it make if it's a different culture? Imagine you can do it with the abortion debate, or you can do it with the Nazis, or, where someone says, let's take abortion for a moment. There's a wonderful bumper sticker, wonderful for philosophy, which said, if you don't like abortion, don't have one. But you see, from my point of view, abortion is murder. So if I see A killing B, is it appropriate to say, well, I don't like murder, so I won't commit one, but A's killing B, it's nothing to me. On the contrary, he's committing murder. In my world, you stop people from committing murder because it's evil. So to say, if you don't like abortion, don't have one, is to already cast it as a matter of choice, as if there weren't any values involved. And the other guy says, I don't believe in your values. My response is, you don't believe that you're committing murder, but I do believe that you're committing murder. And he says, I believe that you're committing murder. I'm going to stop you if I can.
So it's an application of moral standards. That's
right, and you don't have to be embarrassed because he won't agree or he has a different form of life. Let me compare this with, let's say, with arithmetic. Because I told you, certain philosophers, good philosophers, compare morality with arithmetic on this level. They say, well, there are cultures in which 2 plus 3 is 6. Really? No, there aren't. No, there aren't. Because 2 plus 3 isn't 6, it's 5. Well, that's what they say, that's what they believe. No, they don't. Because they believe that, they wouldn't live till lunchtime. They wouldn't be able to manage their world at all. They'd be out of touch with everything. Well, that's what they say. No, they don't. Probably you're translating their language, you're translating it wrong. And if they say it in English, you don't understand what they mean in English. That happens to people who speak the same language. I mentioned that to you in the middle of a conversation. You say, I don't know what you mean, because if you meant what I meant, it'd be so obvious that you're wrong, you never would have said it. So you can't mean what I mean. You must mean something else. You're an intelligent person. You're a serious person. You can't mean that. So that means that what you do have, perhaps the anthropologists say so, but I don't always trust the anthropologists, that there are peoples who have no numbers. They count 1, 2, 3, many, and that's it. The idea of counting and big sums and comparing is just not part of their culture. Okay, they don't believe 2 plus 3 is 6. They don't have any beliefs about mathematics because they don't have the concepts of mathematics. That's not a disagreement. That's an assertion facing silence. That's not a disagreement. It's not a different mathematics. So there's no reason whatsoever to be embarrassed about that. Now, somebody said yesterday, and I think this is very important, how does this make us different from the Muslim jihadists who want to blow up people?
The aspect of our freedom fighter, you soldiers are freedom fighter. Your terrorists are freedom fighter.
But that's the joke, right? One person's terrorist, another person's freedom fighter. There are people for whom that might not be a contradiction. It's permissible to use terror in order to achieve freedom, right? And that's the way they talk. So now, the problem is this. Let's go back to what we said about the Nazis. The Nazis didn't have a different set of values from ours. They made up a false story about the evil of Jews so that they could kill Jews as a way of saving themselves from the evil the Jews want to do. That's using the old values. That's why they make up the false story. Otherwise, they wouldn't have to make up the story. They would simply say, you like these people, we kill these people. It's a different culture. Right? Okay, now, if that's the case, where does a Muslim suicide bomber stand? He has a story. And the story is the creator of the universe wants him to do this. Well, our attitude is that's the right story to make up, all right. Because if that story were true, it would be a good reason for doing what you're doing. They know what story to make up. Just like the story that the Nazis made up was a good story to support killing Jews, because if they don't kill the Jews are going to kill them, they're going to poison the wells, they're going to destroy society. But it's not enough to have a good story that justifies what you do, it also has to be true. It also has to be true. So then the question will be, what reason do you have for thinking that the creator of the universe wants you to do this? And that's where the buck stops, to have reason. That's why I called my book Reason to Believe. I believe that we have reason, adequate reason to believe, and no other religion does. And no contradictory position does. And I went through that in my book in detail. So what we say to the jihadists is, if your story were true, you would be justified, but it isn't true.
But it's based on interpretation of the text.
Okay, that's a very interesting question. And that I really have a whole share, and I'll just say a little bit for now. The tone of voice in which that usually said is, oh, but that's interpretation. And the implication is, interpretation, is in the eye of the beholder, and you can make a text mean whatever you want. This is the postmodern attitude towards texts, that, there's no objective meaning to the text, it's only what you do with the text, deconstructionism and all the rest. I think that's the kindest word I can say is foolish. Are there difficult texts that are difficult to interpret? Yes, there are. There are also features of the world of physics that are very hard to come to an agreement about, and that doesn't mean that physics is just play. So when you negotiate a contract, you're not putting millions of dollars into an agreement which has no objective meaning, and which can be interpreted as anyone pleases, right? You're putting it into a document which normally carries commitment and agreement, and if it doesn't, it's going to be adjudicated in courts which have procedures for adjudicating it, and that's what gives you the ability to trust the future on the basis of the document. The example that I give is this: you sign an agreement with somebody, and according to the agreement, on the 15th of every month, he has to deliver you $10,000 in cash. January, February, March, April, May, June, everything's fine. July comes, he walks in on the 15th with a box, you open it up, and there's $10,000 in monopoly money. Monopoly money. So you say, come on, where's my money? This is your money. It's a joke. Where does it say in the contract no monopoly money? You didn't write in no monopoly money. This is money. It's monopoly money. Has he got a case? Is it okay now? Oh, gee, it is money. It's just monopoly money, and therefore it's okay. Are you serious about life? Are you serious about what you say? It's ridiculous. So this idea that text can be made to mean anything that you like is it's nonsense. And here's a criterion for interpretation, which I think is very important, not widely understood, I think. I've made a shackle before. You have a text that says something, and you want to explain it or interpret it. So some people say, well, you have to be careful that you don't contradict the text. Don't contradict the text. Okay, that's certainly a requirement. If you contradict the text, then you're not interpreting it. But that's not enough. It's not enough just not to contradict the text. You need to have some positive evidence in the text that this is what it means. So somebody says, I have a new interpretation about Macbeth. Macbeth was trans. Where does it say in the text he wasn't trans? Doesn't say. It's fair to say he was trans. You're coming from a culture that didn't have trans. There's no word in the English language of that time for trans. There's no concept of trans in any of the literature of that time. So there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that that's what this text means. So you can't just interpret it in a way that's consistent with the text. You need to show from the text itself what reason there is to think that this interpretation is correct. Now, sometimes you'll be able to do that for 2 or 3 different interpretations. But that's not the same as just making something up and pushing it in. So that will limit greatly the number of interpretations that are available. And for every text that has 3 different appropriate interpretations, there'll be 100 inappropriate interpretations. So that's simply something that, that limits the scope of interpretation. So are we on the same page as the suicide bombers? In one sense, yes, and in one sense, no. The story isn't an inappropriate story. It's just that there's no reason to think whatsoever that it's true. Okay, now we talked about cultures being able to learn from one another. Is cultural variation something that you should celebrate or regret? Doesn't cultural variation lead to misunderstanding and sometimes lead to conflict and so forth and so on? The answer is yes, it definitely does. But don't exaggerate it. The wars in Europe were horrible and the cultural differences were not that great. This was not the West against the East or the North against the South. This wasn't, in some cases they were all democracies and they were fighting with one another. Another time they were all monarchies and they were fighting with one another. So one shouldn't exaggerate the conflict that's due to cultural variation. Indeed, sometimes cultural variation leads to a kind of pacifism, because if you're not in competition for resources or land and you have nothing particular to share, then it reduces friction. It reduces competition. The Gemara has a very, I would say, deep, insightful, and painful remark. Every person hates some of the people who are in his own discipline. I happen to love classical music. If you play Beethoven the wrong way, I find it very difficult to sit at the same table with you. But if you play jazz, I don't care how you play it. I don't know the right way, I don't know the wrong way, and I don't care to know. So I have no bone to pick with people who play jazz. I have bone to pick with people who do the things that I care about. So if the two cultures don't overlap, there'll be just disinterest. You do what you do, and I'll do what I do. There's nothing to talk about. So, on the other hand, cultural variation enriches human resources. You have a wide variety of ideas, a wide variety of perceptions, a wide variety of reactions and processes that are under control, and a wide variety of resources, which then opens up possibilities to people. That's what they say, travel broadens the mind. To a certain extent, that's really true, because you see possibilities that you never dreamt of. Makes life richer for individuals, and enables cultures to grow and develop and evolve in ways that improve the life for the people there. So, by the way, even contemporary politicians get this wrong. E pluribus unum, one of the slogans of the United States. From many, one. There are 2 different ways to do that, and people are getting mixed up about it. I'll give you the analogy. We just have it now in Vayetze. Yaakov goes to sleep, and it says, you got this right the other day, it says he took from the stones of the place and put it around his head. And in the morning it says he picked up the stone that he put at his head, and he made it in, and he anointed it. So the commentators point out, first he talked about stones, and he talked about the stone. So the commentators say there were many stones, and they became one stone. Now, some Sefer Musar, I don't remember which one, asks the following question. By what process did the many stones become one? And here are two alternatives. You can grind all the stones up into a powder, mix it well, and make cement. Then you'll end up with one stone of cement. And the other is you could take the stones and glue them together. So you say, what are you talking about? Why are you interested in that? Yeah, this is an interesting question to you? Yeah, it's an interesting question because this is a model for making a unity out of a group of people. How do you unify them? And grinding them up into powder and making cement means it's uniform. You make them all the same. And when you take the stones and glue them together, here you have granite, and here you have quartz, and here you have sandstone, and here you have rubies. They all have their individual character, but they're connected to one another. Now let me ask you, what do you think will produce richer music? 80 violins all playing the same note? Or an orchestra with violins and violas and cellos and flutes and oboes and clarinets and French and English horns and French horns and trumpets and trombones and so forth, which will make the richer music. You don't make a greater unity by making everyone the same. You make a greater unity by taking people and using their differences in an integrated way to make a group that has great potential because of the differences between them. So you want to preserve, and that's what e pluribus unum means. From a plurality, from a multiplicity of people, leave them different and make a unified, functioning society out of it. Being different. That's what it originally meant. Didn't mean the melting pot. E pluribus unum is not the melting pot. It's a mistake. The melting pot, now on the other hand, if you have cultures like we have today, where the cultures with which the immigrants come is an anti-American culture, if they came to America to burn American flags, then either assimilate or leave. Because there's no point in inviting your enemies to live in your house. Why would you do that? But short of that, the variety of cultures is something to be celebrated. And the truth is, even internally, to a certain extent, each tribe of the 12 tribes had a different subculture. They had different economics, and therefore they contributed different things to the life of the whole. The famous example is Yisachar and Zvulun. Yisachar was a tribe of scholars. They headed the Sanhedrins, of which there were many, smaller Sanhedrins, 23. And Zvulun were merchants, and they made a deal. Zvulun's money that they got from practicing trade, they used to support Yisachar, and therefore half of Yisachar's merit of learning Torah went to Zvulun. And the commentators point out, when the two tribes are mentioned together, Zvulun is mentioned first. Because he's the cause of it. He's the one that makes it happen. So the variety of cultures, the variety of economics, variety of priorities, all of that can be a positive thing. The Arizal says that each of the ancient tribes had its own siddur, because the way you pray is to a certain extent a reflection of who you are. Then the question is communication between the cultures and forging a way in which the cultures can contribute together to a larger unity. That's and in fact, there's one or two more applications of this which are worthwhile knowing. You have the generation of dispersion, the Tower of Babel. Torah says they built a city and a tower in the middle of the city, and God was very displeased with what they were doing. They were all of one language, which means that they all spoke Hebrew, though they might have had private languages elsewhere. That's another story. Anyway, and it caused them not to be able to understand one another and spread them out. What crime? What was the crime? So there's a lot of oral tradition about this. The Or Chaim says something, which I only read a couple of years ago. I was almost shocked. If you look at the verses in the book of Genesis, you could see word for word, literally, a central crime which they committed. Because when God said to Adam and Chava, Pru urvu umilu es haaretz v'chivshuha, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. That doesn't mean to live all together in one valley. Fill the earth doesn't mean that. They were given an explicit instruction, spread out and occupy the whole earth. And the generation of the Tower of Babel said, we're not doing that. We're not doing that. We're going to be all together. We're going to build a tower to make sure that we don't get spread out. So they're pledging allegiance against exactly what God said. So the idea then was, I should tell you this, one of the sources says that when it says the whole earth was of one language, it means this. You have many different nations, and each nation has its own different language, in addition to which there was an international language. And that's the one language. It doesn't say they only had one language, it said they had one language. And by the way, this was the case in world history. I think 400 years ago, the international language was French, because the French had so many colonies. And now the international language has become English. Go to any major city in any place in the world, you'll find people who speak English. They have to. Otherwise, they can't get along. So they had this international language. Now, when they became incapable of understanding one another, and they scattered, and now you have different people with different languages without the ability to communicate, and the cultures developed in different ways, what's the goal? Well, the goal is unity. The goal is still unity. The goal was to spread out over the whole world and be unified in that way. And they refused to do it. So rebuilding unity, the League of Nations under Woodrow Wilson and now the United Nations, as corrupt as they are and as idiotic as they are, but the goal of creating a unified world is a goal that the Torah would agree with. But the idea is not to make everyone homogeneous. It's to make the differences between peoples the kind of thing that people can weld together into a joint effort. I remember reading a science fiction story many years ago. The Americans had a space station, and there were some Americans on the space station, and the return vehicle it got damaged somehow, and they were going to run out of food and oxygen, and they were going to die. And the only way to be able to save them would be if America and Russia would work together to build a replacement. And the idea was cooked up in secret by the Americans so as to stop the Cold War. By forcing America and Russia to jointly contribute to an effort, and in that way to come to accommodate to one another. And the story is that they went up and they found the people there were dead, and so on and so on. But it stopped the Cold War and it created cooperation. And the truth is, at the end of the story, it says this guy's walking down the street, and somebody looks at him and says, "Do I know you? Do I recognize you?" And he hurries and says, "No, you don't," because the truth is they didn't die. The truth is the guy was saved, but they needed him to die for the story, and that was the guy. Somebody recognized. Okay, it was a nice story. But that's the idea of creating cooperation out of the interaction of different points of view. Different, you really have this in the way the Gemara describes the creation of man. It says a human being who mints coins, he has the soft metal and he has a mint, and he puts the metal in and he lowers the stamp, and it stamps an image into the coin, and every coin is the same. And he says God had also his stamp to mint people with, that is to say, B'Tselem Elokim. We're made in God's form, not picture, not image, form, right? But people come out different. Everyone comes out different. That's when God does it. The underlying basis is the same, but people's ideas and people's perceptions, people's values and priorities are different from one another. He wants it that way. Because in that way you have to reach out of yourself to accommodate someone different from yourself and to relate and to share with someone who's different from yourself. That's part of the human gesture of life that Kodesh Baruch Hu wants. The most profound case in when this happens is marriage, but it also happens in friendship and so forth and so on. And this is one of the reasons, I know I'm rambling here, and this is one of the reasons why marriage is a committed union between a man and a woman. Yes, that's right, and you can quote me, right? Because of the difference between men and women. Precisely because of the difference. Because then you have to reach out of yourself to another who can, together with you, create a much richer unity than you could otherwise. And when people say, oh, but can't a man love a man and can't a woman love a woman? The answer is, of course they can. Parents love children, siblings love one another, sometimes you love the friends that you have. Of course, members of the same sex can love one another, but each relationship has a different love. Woe to the person who loves his children the way he loves his friends. Woe to that person. I lived through that era when that's what psychology taught. And it was not a good idea. Each relationship has a different quality of love because of the difference in the quality of the relationship. And a man and a woman, because of their differences, create a very rich relationship when they do so in a committed way. So this idea of reaching out of yourself across a psychological barrier or a cultural barrier is something that's built into the Jewish experience. One more example. I'm picking the examples because I want to show you that things that looks totally unrelated. What about a minyan? A man's supposed to daven in a minyan. 9 other guys. Well, guess what? It's not going to be ideal for any one of them. Everyone makes compromises when he goes to a minyan, almost everyone. Because it's a little too fast, a little too slow, a little too loud, or wrong accent, or whatever it is. And that part of being in a minyan is to compromise. That's part of the idea of a minyan, is to compromise. To be able to form a larger whole out of the compromises in relationship to those who are different from you. This is an essential element of human development. Okay. So much from my side for multiculturalism. But if other questions come up, or you have other ideas about it, I'm happy to go back to it.